Hello there, and welcome back to our IELTS preparation video series. Today we're going to be focusing on what you can expect from part two of the speaking portion of the exam and how to best prepare yourself for what this part of the examination is going to bring to the table. So similar to what we did in part one, we're going to be covering the appropriate structure to follow when composing your answers in part two so that you maintain a high level of the appropriate scoring attributes in your answers overall. So with that being said, let's get started. So the first thing I'd like to mention in part two is, obviously it comes after part one. And what's going to happen at the beginning of part two of the exam is your examiner is going to be giving you a cue card or a little prompt card with the topic at which you're supposed to speak about, along with the main topic at hand. You're going to be given 3 to 4 prompt questions essentially, which you can focus your answer around. And you're going to be required to speak for 1 to 2 minutes approximately. Now, it's suggested as a rule to speak for about a minute and a half minimally. Anything less than this and your fluency score might be reduced is because your answer could contain parts that might be too short, too simple, or too direct. Now understand that with the main topic, and I'm going to break this down a little bit more in a little bit and show you an example of what I mean when there's going to be a main topic as well as prompt questions. But the prompt questions are really there as a guideline. You do not or are not required to stick to them. However, with that being said, with the prompt questions, it is a good idea to maintain your answer around those questions. You definitely do not want to break off and change the subject or talk about something entirely different. Obviously, that would reduce your score there. But again, just a note, you don't have to follow the prompt questions exactly. Um, so moving on here, when you get given the cue card, you're going to be given a about 1 minute of preparation time. So you're going to be able to read the cue card and then give yourself a minute with a piece of paper um, to kind of highlight what you want to talk about and give yourself a minute to prepare, essentially. So what you want to do with that minute is you want to first off select the things that you're going to be talking about, of course. Um, you want to be talking about things that are kind of noted here in these three particular categories or features. You want to pick things that have lots of features, essentially, things that have a lot of variations or something that you can break into and speak at length about. Obviously, you want to be expandable. You want to be able to expand on the ideas or the concepts which you bring up in your answer. I think I mentioned a little bit about this in the part one video when I was talking about composing your answers to some of the question types that you'll experience or face in part one. You don't want to paint yourself into a corner, right? You want to say things as generally as possible when you're giving your answers, so that gives you plenty of opportunity to then dive in and add detail or break down um, or dive into particular facets or avenues of an idea and so on. You don't want to just straight off the bat start talking about very specific items because that's going to limit your or the things that you can essentially talk about. The preceding parts of your answer. And then you also want to be able to include some invented aspects. So what I mean by this is just like how I mentioned in the last video for part one, you're not going to be graded on the actual content of your answer, the factuality of the facts or the ideas, the concepts that you bring up in your answers. You're not going to be graded on how true or relevant, sorry, or how true they are. They do have to be relevant, of course, to the answer or to the topic at hand. But for example, if you're talking about in part two, a friend of yours, and you go in to say that Jackie Chan is a friend of yours and that you guys live next door to each other and that you're good friends and that you do things on the weekends, you do different activities and so on, as long as that's presented in the appropriate structure with proper linking phrases, nice complexity in grammar and sentence structure, that's totally fine. And you're going to be scored um, just as well as if you decide to talk about an actual friend of yours. And who knows, you might actually be friends with Jackie Ten. But what I'm saying there essentially is give yourself the opportunity to invent some points or invent some aspects about whatever it is you're talking about, because there might come a time where you're trying your best to fill that 1 to 2 minutes of speaking and you might run out of things to say. So at that point, you just got to throw in some things that you just make up about the topic. And again, that's not going to hinder or take away from your score at all, as long as it's presented in the appropriate sort of manner. Something I forgot to mention about speaking for that 1 to 2 minutes, a lot of people think that that's a long time to be speaking or giving an answer. My biggest suggestion for being able to fill that time appropriately is to simply speak slowly. Be collected, speak well and fluently, obviously, but you do not have to ramble on and rattle off your answer as quickly as possible. Because ultimately, the faster you speak, the quicker you're going to get through your material, and then you're going to be left, at the 45-second mark, trying to fill, the rest of your answer with absolute gibberish that might not sound as concise and as well as the first part of your answer. So just do your best to speak slowly, relax. You're not being graded on the speed or quickness of your answer, but in the way that you present everything that you're talking about. Okay? Um, and then the second thing you want to do in your minutes preparation is obviously vocabulary. This is a good time or good opportunity to focus on some uncommon or complex vocabulary that you could include in your answer. Write down 5 or so words, uncommon words that are specifically related to the topic in which you're speaking about, and then obviously integrate those uncommon words into your answer at some points. And then lastly, you want to focus on the grammar or the grammar point in which you're going to be composing your answer around. Decide the tense, whether it be past, present, conditional tense, so on and so forth. Just you're aware of how you're going to conduct grammarly the rest of your answer. Also important to remember, you're going to want to use linking phrases, lead-in phrases in every sentence. Again, the structure to part two is going to be very similar to the structure or the formula that we put together in part one, right? With the introduction, linking phrases point, linking phrases reason, so on and so forth. Essentially, it's going to be that. Now, you do have the opportunity to vary that somewhat, but as long as you maintain a good amount of linking phrases with the lead-in or introductory phrases in just about every sentence, you're going to have that complex structure, which is required to maintain a good score in fluency and coherence. So moving on here, just to mention, again, this structure is what we employ because in using or following this structure, you're going to have 3 strong attributes here, which are all going to be relevant to the scoring, to the band which you're going to achieve in the exam. And those 3 features are complex linking structures, which relate to fluency and coherence, redundant language, which again relates to fluency and coherence, and then complex grammar, which relates to grammar accuracy and range. So those are 2 out of the 4 categories in which you're going to be scored on. So we're already, if you're following the structure, we're already maintaining high marks with these strong features for those 2 categories. The only 2 that are left are lexical resource and then pronunciation. So lexical resource should be covered for you if you did a little bit of preparation and you understand how to apply appropriately uncommon language and uncommon vocabulary and complex vocabulary at times. Again, you're going to be scoring well in um, lexical resource, and then pronunciation, right, which is going to be, obviously individual, and you're going to have to focus then on that based on your skill set, your ability to properly pronounce, and like we talked about previously. But in using this structure, that's why we encourage using this particular structure because it's going to maintain 2 out of those 4 categories, and then it's really up to you just to include the addition of the other 2 categories through your own doing. Um, so let's look at an example question now. This is essentially what's going to be read on the cue card that you're going to be given. So the main topic here is describe an animal that can be found in your country. So the 4 prompt questions included here are what type of animal it is, where can it be found, whether you've seen it, and what other people think of this animal. So again, these 4 points that are included here, you don't necessarily have to answer or follow exactly in your answer, but they're the guidelines for your answer, and they're the guidelines for our structure, and it's kind of what we base the structure of your answer on. So as much as I say you don't have to follow it, I really encourage that you do, because then you're leaving less work for yourself ultimately, because if you're not going to answer these questions, you then have to think of what kind of position you're going to take, or where you're going to kind of continue your answer to, or the things that you're going to bring up in your answer. So you're just causing yourself more work, more effort, which Probably isn't the smartest way to go about this, but you have the option, is all I'm trying to say. So now that we're familiar with what the topic and the prompt questions are going to look like, let's look at the actual part two structure that you're going to use when composing your answers. So you're going to notice this is very, very similar to a lot of the part one structure, answer structures that we covered in the last video. Again, I'm going to write down the formula here just so we keep it in mind. Again, this isn't exactly the formula for every part of your answer, but for the most part, it's going to revolve around this sort of makeup or structure. We're going to have an introductory or intro phrase, right, which is essentially a linking phrase, just introducing our idea or our point. Then we're going to have a linking phrase into our first point. We'll just put here point. And then after our linking phrase, we're going to have, after our first point rather, we're going to have another linking phrase, which then transitions into our reason. And our reason supports our point. It specifies why our point was relevant in our answer, so on and so forth. So for the most part, every single answer or every single sentence that you provide in your answer is going to somewhat follow this structure with appropriate linking phrases, outlining your point, and then supporting or having support by your reason, from your reason, after a sequential linking phrase. So it sounds rather simple. It's a little bit harder in application, obviously. The key there is to get comfortable with inserting those linking phrases and familiarizing yourself with the different kinds of linking phrases that are appropriate in different points in your sentences, as well as different points in your answers overall. But for the most part, I hope at this point you understand how linking phrases operate. They're just like conjunctions, which connect and bring together the different ideas or different parts of a sentence, right? And help signpost and transition from one idea or one thing to another, essentially, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of our answer, so on and so forth. So in any case, the opening structure, or the structure that we're going to follow in answering part two, the beginning of our answer for part two here is we're going to have an opening phrase, including the first prompt to the card. So a lot of linking phrases we've kind of exemplified here, provided examples for. Let me read off a couple of them there so you can get a good idea on the type of linking phrase you want to use as your opening or introductory phrase. So you're going to want to say something like, okay, then I guess I could start off by answering. So to begin with, in reply to the initial point of, right then, I'd like to begin by pointing out that, okay, so my first point here would obviously be, so I guess I would kick off by stating that, blah, 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 the blah, blah, blah is. Initially, I'd like to get started by looking at, so, relating back to the topic at hand and the question prompts that we have, describe an animal that can be found in your country, you can simply insert that right here after the opening phrase. You could say something like, let me write it out here. Okay, then I guess I could start off by answering that there are, oops, that's a little too big. Let me make that a tad smaller just so we can fit it in. Answering that there are a wide range of animals found in China or wherever your country is that you're going to be representing in your answer. So that little bit there is the inclusion of the prompt, right, or the main topic of the question, and then we're going to use a linking phrase to essentially answering our first question, which is what type of animal is it, right? So we're going to say something like, and I think I would have to choose, and the one that I'd pick is, or I would have to go for, and my choice is going to be, something along those lines, that type of linking phrase. So continuing here, again, what we have is, okay, then I guess I could start off by answering that there are a wide range of animals found in China, but let's see, and I think I would have to choose the panda, the giant panda, or something like that. All right, and then that's not the end of our sentence again. We're going to link add another linking phrase, you guessed it, to our reason, because this is answering the first part of our question, or this it's establishing our point in this sentence. And then we're going to transition with the linking phrase. Like a linking phrase we could use is, and this is due to the fact that, and the reason why I chose this is because, and what I would also like to add here is that, so on and so forth. So we'll pick something like, and the reason why I chose this animal is because it is, let's say, it is synonymous with Chinese culture or something like that. So notice here how, I mean, we keep hammering on the fact that you need to use linking phrases to connect your ideas and so on. Your linking phrases in reality don't necessarily have to be big and emboldened and complex or anything like that. I mean, there are going to be times where you can put very simple linking phrases to kind of transition different points in your answer, these linking phrases down here are very, very simple. And this is due to the fact that. And the reason that I chose this is because these are all very simple ways to transition into the following points in your sentence. Obviously, this whole answer, although a little long-winded, sounds a lot better than stating there's a lot of animals in China. Um, I picked the I picked to speak about the giant panda because pandas are very famous in China, right? I mean, that is saying essentially the exact same thing that we've written out here. But obviously, this way of phrasing it and this way of wording it with the appropriate linking phrases, so on and so forth, is much more complex and has a much more appropriate structure to maintain those values or those features that we want to achieve high marks in fluency and coherence and grammatical range and accuracy, right? So I hope that's well understood. Um, so yeah, that's going to essentially answer our prompt and then the first part of our question. And again, the reason we stick to these questions is because it's very easy to follow the structure or follow the structure when these questions are used as the guideline to our answer, because the next part of the structure is simply going to continue into answering the second question or the second guideline. So we're going to use an opening linking phrase, something along the lines of going to my next point, which is blah, 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 continuing with the next point of, right? And remember, the next point that we're talking about is where can it be found? This next guideline question or prompt question. So actually, let me write that down so we don't have to keep going back and forth here. So the second guideline question is where can it be found? Right? Some other linking phrases are, now with regards to the question, the next question of where it can be found or where it can be located, right? If we have the opportunity, we do want to try to restate or rephrase each of the prompt questions or each of the guideline questions that you're going to be answering if you have the opportunity. It's not necessarily required, although if you fail to add a little bit of varied redundant language, you might be marked down in coherence or fluency and coherence rather. So just keep that in mind. But I mean, don't let that stop you from continuing with your question or continuing with your answer. So now on the subject of where it can be located or where you can find it in the wilderness, so on and so forth. Then obviously we're going to use another linking phrase, just like how we did previously, to transition into our first point, right? So intro phrase, linking phrase, point. Our first point is going to be, we're going to use a linking phrase similar to, and what I would like to add here is, and what I need to emphasize here is that, and what I ought to stress here is that, so on and so forth. So we would say something up until this point like, going to my next point, which is where can the giant panda be found? And what I would like to add here is giant panda is in fact an endangered species. I think it's an endangered species, isn't it? What I'd like to add here is that it is an endangered species. So that was our point. Now we're going to again use another linking phrase to transition into our reason or our supporting reason behind stating that point. So you would say something like, this is due to the fact that, and the reason why I chose this is because, and I would also like to add here is that, so notice how most of these linking phrases, the vast majority of these linking phrases, I mean, we have quite a few here outlined and specified as examples to you. They're all different. They all say essentially the same things in each category, like this linking phrase transitioning into our reason, say the same things as these linking phrases transitioning into our reasons, but they're all worded and phrased a little bit different. That's another point I want to kind of hammer home is you do not want to be repeating the same linking phrases over and over again in each part of your answer, obviously. That is going to get you marked down somewhat. So take the opportunity to familiarize yourself with not only specific linking phrases that you can use or like the examples that we have here, not just memorizing what these linking phrases say, but how each of the linking phrases are kind of worded in between or at the points where they are in the structure, right? Like this group of linking phrases here, as examples here, can link into our second prompt or link into our first point answering the prompt, right? Then these linking phrases transition or link from our point into our reason. So you're going to want to figure out a way to essentially compose your own linking phrases at those specific joints or those specific points essentially in your sentences, in your answers, so that you're not stuck in the middle of providing orally your answer and trying to quickly think of a linking phrase to insert there before transitioning into your point. Hopefully that makes sense. So in any case, after mentioning our point, and the point that I stated here was, and what I would like to add here is that the giant panda is an endangered animal. This is due to the fact that it has experienced, and this is now composing our reason. This is due to the fact that it has experienced a severe habitat loss in the last several decades, which has limited its range to certain parts of China in remote areas of the wilderness, something along those lines. Again, we don't have to be factual necessarily. We just have to have the appropriate structure to maintain complexity, appropriate grammar range and accuracy. I'm sure you understand that by now. But that's essentially how we're going to be composing our answers to each of the prompt questions. So just like we have here, I mean, again, we're going to be having slightly different linking phrases, noting and kind of signposting that we're transitioning into um, different parts of our answer or answering different questions in our overall answer, right? Like this is, again, answering the third question or the third question prompt, which is whether you have seen it. So let me write that down here. Whether I have seen it. So some examples of some linking phrases you want to use would be progressing to the subject of, drawing attention to the matter of. I mean, in reality, you could say something very simple like the third point I would like to mention. I mean, we can specify that. It might sound a little strange if you go the first point, the second point, the third point, but it's just an example if you're a little lost for words, or you can't think of the perfect linking phrase to use at that point. I mean, use something. Don't 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 exclude a linking phrase if you can't think of anything. Just think of a nice simple conjunction to transition into your next idea or the next point of your answer. So again, some other examples would be moving forward into the area of or proceeding with the issue of whether or not I have seen it. And what I'd like to shed some light on here is that, or what I ought to stress here is that, what I need to emphasize here is that I have in fact seen it. I often visit once a year, to various ranges near our various wilderness reserves near my home so that I may visit and learn more about this majestic creature. And something along those lines, but it's not the end of our sentence. We are going to use another linking phrase to support our reason or transition into our supporting reason. So this is due to the fact that, the reason I chose this because, or the reason I bring that up, the reason I mentioned that, see? I will also like to add here is that I enjoy learning more about the giant panda because it is a sign of national patriotism in Chinese culture and the view of China as a global entity or something along those lines. I'm going to go over the overall answer later on. I have a good composition of what the overall answer should look like with the structure included. At this point, we're just covering the appropriate structure for each prompt question essentially in your answer. So now we're going to move into the last prompt question, or the last guideline question, right, from the card that we're looking at. So we'd want to use a linking phrase, something along the tune of finally then, or lastly, I would like to state that. As a final point, I would like to answer the last question being, what other people think about this animal. So let me write that out here. What other people think about, this animal. So finally then, I would like to answer the last question of what other people think about this animal. And what I would like to emphasize here is that the giant panda is only found in the country of China. So it is a significant symbol, or again, synonymous with Chinese culture, Chinese patriotism, blah, 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 blah. And that's not the key detail. We don't need to focus too much on that. We could, again, honestly say gibberish or say something that is totally incorrect in that statement or in that part of the statement. And we're just going to have to transition into our reason. Right? Again, another bogus reason behind stating that point. Although you don't have to make up points, obviously. If you do have relevant, again, everything does need to be relevant. I keep mistakenly saying relevant. If you do have a correct or factual response or factual point to include, by all means, of course, include it. The point I just want to emphasize there is that, look at that linking phrase. The point I just want to emphasize there is that if you ever get stuck, or don't let yourself get stuck, essentially, if you're going to say, like, if maybe we don't know what other people think about this animal, so we really just need to add some filler, or just add some details there. So don't let yourself get hung up on it. I have seen too many students, too many people get to a point in their answer where they say, and the next thing I would like to mention is that, or I would like to answer the question about, what people think about the giant panda, and what I'd like to say here is, and then they draw a blank and they don't know what to say. Again, if you have something relevant, sorry, not relevant. If you have something correct or factual to say, by all means, do your best to input that, but don't let your inability to come up with something correct or factual hinder you from adding, something of value in your answer or the appropriate content. The appropriate content does not have to be factual. I continue to repeat that because a lot of people get hung up on that fact and let that take away and subtract from their answer now. Because if you're now sitting there hung up on a point, not knowing what to say, obviously you're losing time and you're getting marked down for your fluency and coherence, right? Because you're not being very fluent now. You're not being very your answer is not flowing anymore. You're stopping, you're stuttering, you're not knowing what to say. This also kind of brings into mind that you need to speak slowly, because if you speak too fast, you're going to run out of things to say very, very quickly, and you're not going to maintain the appropriate time frame to speak, the 1 to 2 minutes, and your brain's not likely going to be able to cope to input the appropriate things in your answers in between your linking phrases and so on to make your answer nice and coherent. So just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that I'm not an expert on the giant panda. So if I am saying anything incorrect here, doesn't matter. Just supports my point even more that your answer will still be entirely sufficient if everything you say is in fact incorrect. Incorrect in terms of factuality. In any case, finally then, I would like to answer the last question of what other people think about this animal. And what I would like to add here is that the giant panda is really synonymous with Chinese patriotism and the symbol. It is a symbol of China, and most people across the globe associate the image of the giant panda with Chinese and the Chinese people. This is due to the fact that the giant panda is only found in the country of China, and in fact, the Chinese government owns every single panda across the globe, in spite of individual members of that species being located in zoos across various cities around the world. I believe that's an actual fact. I think I've heard that somewhere. But in any case, there we go. There's our answer. Again, it's all about using the appropriate linking phrases to maintain the appropriate complex structure in our answers. These linking phrases, although simple and easy to input for the most part, can be difficult if you're not accustomed or familiar with how to use them in your sentences. Again, it's not necessarily um, a typical way in which people communicate verbally with each other, using these drawn out linking phrases to answer questions and so on. So hopefully you got a little bit of familiarity in part one after we covered in depthly each of the question types and the appropriate structures with linking phrases and transitional statements and proper signposting there to begin to get a little bit of understanding and get accustomed to composing your answers and speaking with the appropriate linking phrases, but you can see that theme continues into part two, and it's going to continue into part three. So the key here is to just be accustomed and be ready to insert these linking phrases into your answers, just to transition appropriately into the points that you'd like to make in answering the actual questions that are asked of you in each part of the exam. So with that being said, let's look at the example response here that's composed for the topic at hand here with the guideline questions. So I'll read off the example response. So to begin with, in reply to the initial point of what type of animal it is, and the one I picked is the giant panda. Actually, there are two types of pandas, the lesser or red panda and the commonly known giant panda, which is the national symbol of China. Now, concerning the matter of where it can be found, and what I ought to stress here is that because it is an endangered species, it lives mostly in protective nature reserves in Western China, although it is possible to see them in zoos around the world. Moving on to the question of whether I have seen it, I suppose I should underline the fact that I visited a panda sanctuary in Chengdu 2 years ago when I was traveling in the Sichuan province. It was actually a one-day tour of the panda's habitat, which included lectures from conservation experts. And as a final point, I would like to focus on the point of what people think about this animal. I guess that most Chinese people feel some sense of patriotism towards the giant panda because it is recognized globally as a symbol of China and friendship. So there we go. We have the entire structure composed there in the appropriate manner, relating to each of the guideline questions that were associated to the prompt at hand. So it's relatively straightforward. And for the most part, as long as you have a good understanding and comfort level with composing your responses and your answer with the appropriate linking phrases and complexity in that sense, you should have no trouble in answering any questions that you experience in part two. Now, on that note, just to kind of have you understand some of the major themes regarding the questions that you might encounter in part two, nearly all of the questions that are provided or given in part two of the exam focus around these five particular themes. The themes are a person, right? So you're going to want to talk about a famous person, or you're going to be asked to talk about a famous person, maybe a family member or a good friend. Um, Another category, another theme is an item. So you're going to talk about something that's important to you, something that you use every day, maybe a gift or a present, so on and so forth. You're going to be asked to talk about maybe a story, talk about a movie that you saw, a TV show that you watched, a book that you read, something like that, an activity, which is something that you like to do with friends, something that you do by yourself, something that you do at a specific time, like after dinner, or an event, like a holiday, a memorable time, a memorable event, or a happy or sad experience that you might have had. So, you're going to want to decide on when you get asked a question about one of these general themes, or the question that you get asked is relating to one of these general themes. Obviously, you're going to want to specify in your preparation, like we talked about, what you're going to be talking about in particular, right? So, for example, some of the things that we mentioned here, like if you're going to be talking about a person, a famous person, you could talk about Jackie Chan, you could talk about any kind of famous actor or sports idol or anybody in particular you can choose. Um, for item, you could choose something like an iPhone. For a story, you could choose the Titanic, right? An activity, you could choose something like tennis. An event, you could choose something like a birthday party. So again, for each of the topics that you choose, or for the topic that you choose in particular, you're going to want to prepare at least 5 uncommon vocabulary words, or uncommon words that you can use and insert in your answer. Because again, we have to keep in mind the lexical resource category, which we want to score well at to achieve a good band in that. Um, So relating to like Jackie Chan, he is an actor. He knows martial arts. He is world renowned, right? He is a TV personality, a movie personality. For items like an iPhone, right? It's a gadget. It's a piece of technology. Um, it's a handheld device. You can mention some of the materials that it's made out of, some of the specific things like that. The story of the Titanic. You want to give specific details pertaining to that. The story overall is it's a love story, right? It's almost a bit of what's the word I'm looking for? Um, it's almost like an epic, really, or that type of story. You can mention the characters in it. Obviously, you can mention any specific details or specific relevant vocabularies to that. The activity of tennis. I'm just kind of going through the examples now, but I believe you get the point. You want to write down or at least be familiar with at least 5 uncommon vocabulary words. You want to take the opportunity to use as many as you can, because the more that you use, obviously, the higher you'll score in lexical resource. So that's more power to you in that regard. Now, I don't want to mention here as well is although we want to focus on uncommon vocabulary words, and again, those are words that are specifically relevant to the topic in which you're talking about that can't really be used outside of that context, you still want to use complex vocabularies as well. Colorful words like you want to use extravagant versus great. You want to use words like fantastic versus good, or something like that. You want to avoid using too simple and too basic vocabularies. Um, and if the opportunity permits, use more complex or varied vocabulary words, just to continue to add to that lexical resource. But again, along that same note, um, if you have the opportunity to use an uncommon word in place of even a complex word, take that opportunity. You don't want to take away from that, if that makes sense. So, why can't, well, oh, it's not letting me scroll. So that covers the structure, essentially. Let's quickly look at 1 or 2 examples here. Let me just pull it up. Some sample questions that you might experience. These are specific questions that you might experience in part 2 of the exam particularly. So let me pull it up here. Let's talk about this one. Maybe just open it up. Give me a second to set this up.